The night the storm came ashore, it did not arrive quietly. It tore across the coastline with a restless fury, rattling windows, bending trees, and dragging the ocean into a violent conversation with the land. At the edge of that chaos stood the coastal estate of Bill Spencer, an imposing structure overlooking the dark, churning sea, as if it had been built to defy both nature and consequence. But even the strongest walls cannot keep out what has already begun within them. On this night, beneath the roar of wind and thunder, something far more dangerous than the storm itself would unfold, something irreversible, something that would ripple outward and entangle every life connected to it. Inside that house, tension had already taken root long before the first flash of lightning split the sky. Melissa Dillon, portrayed by Sydney Bullock, stood at the center of a truth that had become too heavy to carry in silence. She had seen too much, understood too much, and perhaps most dangerously, she had chosen to speak. In a world where secrets function as currency and silence often ensures survival, Dillon had stepped beyond the invisible line that separates observer from participant. She had decided that what she knew about manipulation, about coercion, about the subtle but undeniable pattern in Ivy's behavior, was no longer something she could keep to herself. And in doing so, she had unknowingly placed herself in the path of something far more volatile than she anticipated. Remy Price, portrayed by Christian Weissman, was not a man accustomed to losing control, or at least, not in a way that others could easily perceive. He had spent years mastering the art of quiet influence, of shaping situations from the shadows, of bending outcomes without ever appearing to force them. His strength lay not in overt aggression, but in precision, in patience. But patience has limits. And on this night, those limits were shattered. The confrontation between Remy and Dillon did not begin as an explosion. It began as a standoff, tense, brittle, charged with the kind of silence that suggests something is about to break. The storm outside seemed to echo the atmosphere within, each crack of thunder punctuating the escalating pressure between them. Dillon's voice, when she finally spoke, was steady, though beneath it lay a current of fear she could not entirely suppress. She told him what she intended to do. She told him she would go to the police. She told him that whatever manipulation he believed he could maintain, whatever control he thought he still possessed, it was over. There are moments when words become weapons. This was one of them. For Remy, her declaration was not simply a threat, it was annihilation. Everything he had constructed, every carefully managed perception, every hidden connection, every leverage point he had cultivated, it all hung in the balance of her decision. And in that moment, faced with the possibility of exposure, something within him fractured. Not loudly, not visibly at first, but decisively. What followed was not premeditated violence. It was something more dangerous, a loss of control fueled by desperation. Dillon moved toward the door, her instinct for self-preservation overriding any remaining hesitation. She understood, perhaps too late, that she had pushed him into a corner from which he would not retreat quietly. The distance between them closed too quickly. A hand reached out, not calculated, not measured, but reactive. A shove. And then, silence. The sound of her body hitting the stairs seemed to echo longer than it should have, as though time itself had slowed to bear witness. The fall was not dramatic, not prolonged. It was abrupt, final, and devastating in its simplicity. When she reached the bottom, she did not move. For a moment, one suspended, breathless moment, the storm outside seemed to fade into the background, replaced by an unnatural stillness that filled the house. Remy stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. This was not part of any plan. This was not a calculated move. This was a mistake. But some mistakes cannot be undone. He approached slowly, as though distance might somehow alter reality. But the truth remained unchanged. Dillon was gone. The finality of it settled over him like a weight he could neither escape nor fully comprehend. And then, just as quickly, something else emerged. Instinct. Cold, sharp, and terrifyingly efficient. Remy's mind shifted from shock to survival with alarming speed. The emotional impact of what had happened did not disappear. It was simply compartmentalized, pushed aside in favor of something more urgent. Damage control. If the situation could not be reversed, it would have to be rewritten. The transformation was subtle but profound. The man who had stood there moments ago in stunned disbelief was replaced by someone else entirely, someone capable of viewing the scene not as a tragedy, but as a problem to be solved. He moved through the house with calculated purpose. A window forced open. Furniture slightly disturbed. Objects displaced just enough to suggest intrusion, but not enough to raise immediate suspicion. It was not perfect, but it did not need to be. It only needed to be plausible. When he finally reached for his phone, his hand did not tremble. His voice, when he spoke, carried the appropriate mixture of shock and urgency. He reported what he had discovered, positioning himself carefully within the narrative he had just constructed. The first witness, the concerned caller, the man who had arrived too late. And outside, the storm continued to rage, as though nature itself was trying to erase the line between truth and fabrication. By the time authorities arrived, the scene was set, and the consequences had only just begun. The death of Melissa Dillon sent shockwaves through the lives of those connected to her, but nowhere was the impact felt more deeply than in Will Spencer. Will, still reeling from the emotional upheaval surrounding Ivy's pregnancy and the loss of Electra, was unprepared for the magnitude of this new blow. Dillon had been one of the few voices that challenged him, questioned him, saw through the complexities of a situation with unsettling clarity. Her presence had been grounding, even when uncomfortable. Now, that presence was gone, and in its place was grief, confusion, and something else, something far more dangerous: suspicion. Because as investigators began to piece together the events leading up to Dillon's death, certain details emerged, details that did not immediately point to Remy, but instead cast shadows elsewhere. Will's past interactions with Dillon, their disagreements, her concerns about his situation with Ivy, the tension between them. In isolation, none of these elements were damning. Together, they formed a narrative. And narratives, once established, are difficult to dismantle. The investigation, still in its early stages, began to orbit around Will in ways that felt both surreal and terrifying. Questions were asked, timelines examined, motives considered, and while there was no definitive evidence tying him to the crime, the mere suggestion was enough to begin reshaping perception. Will found himself trapped once again, not by obligation this time, but by implication. Every attempt to defend himself felt inadequate, every explanation incomplete. Because how do you prove absence? How do you argue against a narrative that seems to align, however loosely, with the fragments of truth people can see? Meanwhile, Remy remained exactly where he needed to be. Just outside suspicion, observing, adjusting, maintaining control over a situation that had nearly spiraled beyond it. But control, no matter how carefully managed, is never absolute. Because truth, unlike perception, has a way of resurfacing. And somewhere beneath the layers of manipulation, beneath the staged evidence and carefully constructed alibis, beneath the storm that had masked the moment of impact, the reality of what had happened remained unchanged. Melissa Dillon had died, not by chance, not by accident, but because, in one irreversible moment, someone chose action over restraint. As the investigation deepened, as relationships strained under the weight of grief and suspicion, as Will struggled to hold onto what remained of his life, one question began to emerge, quiet at first, then louder, more insistent. What really happened that night? And when the answer finally comes, it will not just clear one name. It will destroy another. In the turbulent, emotionally charged universe of the bold and the beautiful, there are moments when the illusion of control collapses under the weight of truth, when carefully constructed lies begin to fracture, and when the past, no matter how deeply buried, demands to be acknowledged. What follows the death of Melissa Dillon is not merely grief or confusion, but a descent into something darker, more insidious, a web of deception spun with precision, yet doomed by the very human flaws of its architect. Remy Price, portrayed by Christian Weissman, does not sleep that night. The storm outside may have passed, but within the walls of the Spencer estate, a different kind of storm lingers, silent, methodical, and far more dangerous. The moment of violence itself, though brief and chaotic, is already behind him. What remains is the aftermath, the consequence, and more importantly, the necessity to erase it. Remy understands something fundamental about survival. The event itself is only half the battle. The story that follows is what determines everything. And so he begins. The house is eerily quiet, as though even the walls are holding their breath. Every movement he makes is deliberate, stripped of hesitation. He cleans not just for appearance, but for narrative consistency. Every surface, every object, every detail must align with the version of events he intends to present. This is not panic-driven concealment. It is calculated reconstruction. Blood is removed. Footprints obscured. Furniture repositioned with subtle irregularity, just enough to suggest disruption, but not enough to reveal intent. He works through the night, not as a man haunted by what he has done, but as someone refining a performance. There is no room for error, no tolerance for oversight, because Remy knows that the smallest inconsistency can unravel even the most carefully constructed lie. But physical evidence alone is not enough. A convincing alibi is not built solely on absence. It is built on redirection. And Remy has already chosen his targets. R.J. Forrester, portrayed by Brian Nicoletti, and Will Spencer, whose life has already been spiraling under the weight of emotional conflict and personal obligation, become the perfect focal points for his deception. Their tension is real. Their disagreements documented. Their emotional volatility undeniable. Remy does not need to fabricate a conflict. He only needs to amplify it. In his version of events, the narrative is almost elegant in its cruelty. A confrontation between RJ and Will escalates. Words become shouts. Shouts become physical. Dylan, caught in the middle, attempts to intervene. A push, a misstep, a fall, an accident. It is believable. Tragically so. And that is what makes it dangerous. By the time the body is discovered, hidden within the storage room, a space both isolated and easily overlooked, the emotional devastation within the Forrester family is immediate and overwhelming. Dylan's absence is not just a loss, it is a rupture. She had become a presence, a connection point, someone whose quiet observations and unexpected insights had woven her into the fabric of their lives. Now she is gone, and the question of how lingers with unbearable weight. Ridge Forrester, portrayed by Torsten Kay, is among the first to demand answers, his grief quickly transforming into a need for clarity, for accountability. He does not accept ambiguity easily, especially not when it threatens the stability of his family. But clarity, in this moment, is elusive. Because Remy has already begun shaping the narrative. He positions himself not as a suspect, but as a mourner, a grieving relative, a man devastated by loss. His performance is subtle, restrained, and deeply effective. He does not overplay his role. He does not draw unnecessary attention to himself. Instead, he allows others to fill in the gaps, to interpret his presence as loyalty, his silence as sorrow. And for a time it works. Electra, portrayed by Linnea Grace, is particularly vulnerable to this illusion. Already reeling from the collapse of her relationship with Will and the emotional fallout of Ivy's pregnancy, she clings to any sense of stability she can find. Remy, presenting himself as a source of quiet support, becomes someone she trusts, not out of deep connection, but out of emotional necessity. It is not love, not even close, but it is proximity. And proximity is exactly what Remy needs. Because being near Electra means remaining within the center of the narrative, close enough to monitor the investigation, to adjust his behavior, to ensure that suspicion continues to drift elsewhere. Meanwhile, the tension between RJ and Will intensifies under the weight of implication. Will Spencer, already emotionally fragile, finds himself once again positioned at the center of suspicion. His history with Dylan, their disagreements, her attempts to challenge him. All of it is now re-examined through the lens of tragedy. Each interaction becomes evidence. Each misunderstanding becomes motive. He denies it, of course, vehemently. But denial is not proof. And in a world where perception often outweighs fact, his words struggle to gain traction. RJ, on the other hand, is caught in a different kind of turmoil. His growing closeness with Electra places him in a position that is both emotionally complicated and narratively dangerous. He wants to protect her, to support her, to be the stability she needs. But in doing so, he inadvertently deepens the appearance of conflict between himself and Will. The story Remy has constructed begins to take on a life of its own. And like all dangerous stories, it starts to feel real. But lies, no matter how carefully maintained, carry within them the seeds of their own unraveling. For Remy, that unraveling begins with something small, almost insignificant. A detail he overlooked. Liam Spencer, portrayed by Scott Clifton, has never been one to ignore inconsistencies. His instincts, shaped by years of navigating emotional and moral complexities, are attuned to the subtle shifts that others might dismiss. While the investigation unfolds around him, while attention shifts between RJ and Will, Liam remains quietly observant. And it is in that quiet observation that he notices it. The button. A small, seemingly inconsequential object found near the scene. Overlooked by most, dismissed as debris in the chaos of a supposed struggle. But to Liam, it is familiar. Too familiar. Memory is a strange thing. It does not always present itself immediately or clearly. It surfaces in fragments, in flashes, in moments of recognition that feel both certain and uncertain at the same time. Liam turns the button over in his hand, his mind searching, connecting, reconstructing. And then it clicks. He has seen it before. On Remy. The realization does not come with clarity or certainty, but with a growing unease that settles deep within him. It is not proof. Not yet. But it is enough to shift his perspective, to introduce doubt where there was once assumption. And doubt is the beginning of truth. From that moment on, Liam's role changes. He is no longer just an observer. He becomes a quiet investigator. He watches Remy more closely, listens more carefully, begins to question the narrative that has been so readily accepted by others. He does not confront immediately. He does not accuse without evidence. Instead, he gathers, piece by piece, building a picture that others have not yet seen. Meanwhile, Remy begins to feel it. Not the exposure itself, but the shift, the subtle change in energy, the sense that something is no longer entirely under his control. For the first time since that night, uncertainty creeps in. And with it, the possibility that his carefully constructed reality may not hold. Because deception, no matter how precise, is never perfect. And all it takes is one overlooked detail, one unexpected connection, one person willing to look beyond the surface for everything to begin falling apart. As the story continues to unfold, the tension tightens, the stakes rise, and the truth edges closer to the surface. What began as a single act of violence has expanded into a complex web of lies, manipulation, and emotional devastation. And at the center of it all stands Remy Price, a man who believed he could control the narrative, but who may soon discover that some truths can...
Oh,